The winter months in Germany are bitterly cold, and Mark Vogel spent almost all of his time inside the 3-bedroom house he'd inherited from his parents 10 years ago. This story actually starts back in 1994 with the untimely deaths of Mr. and Mrs. Vogel. Mark was always a little socially awkward, and he harbored a love for all things creepy and crawly since he was a boy. He even went on to study zoology so that he could pursue a career surrounded by reptiles, scorpions, and spiders. That was where Mark was, at university as a second-year student in Munich, when he received the news that his parents had died in a car accident on their way to work. He inherited the house and enough money that ensured that he'd never had to work a day in his life. It's not that Mark became a rich orphan or anything, but he certainly had the freedom to take a few years off with no need to worry about money. But instead, Mark decided to withdraw into himself and the house he'd inherited, cutting off all contact with the few friends he'd had and dropping out of school completely. He only had his 2 pet snakes, a tarantula and a pair of rats, for company in that empty house. The only people Mark ever really saw were the clerks at the corner shop where he did his groceries once a week. But even then, Mark's interactions with them were mostly small talk about the weather. They weren't aware of Mark's sudden withdrawal from the outside world, his terrible loss, or the growing obsession with reptiles and spiders that he was developing. What was previously a deep respect and love for the animals that the rest of humanity avoided at all costs became an all-consuming obsession. Mark began to collect specimens from all over Europe, acquiring most of the reptiles and arachnids illegally. By the time the 2000s came around, Mark became proficient with a computer and the underbelly of the internet. His collection went from a few purchases a year to spending thousands of euros every month, hunting down even more animals for his growing collection. He no longer even switched on the lights in his home. Instead, the building was illuminated by the heat lamps from over 200 cages. There were so many of them that he even started placing new tanks in his kitchen and bathroom floors because he simply ran out of space for it all. Even the mice and crickets needed to feed them all were kept in tanks, where Mark meticulously bred and then fed them to his many, many creatures. He had a python, a corn snake, South American geckos, and bearded dragons, just to name a few. But most of all he had spiders. Lots and lots of spiders. The gigantic African huntsmen and tarantulas were displayed with pride. The nondescript but deadly brown recluse, and the eye-catching orb weavers, and vibrant Australian peacock spiders. Mark had them all. The stranger and the more venomous, the better. But none was as prized as his tank of black widows that had a place set right in his bedroom. Now, you'd think that a man with such an extreme hoarding problem of almost 300 tanks full of living creatures would be living in an absolute mess. But quite the contrary. Mark kept his tanks and his surroundings almost painfully clean. His stacks of books on arachnids and serpents were neatly stacked in alphabetical order. He spent his days polishing the glass tanks and meticulously separating the 8-legged creatures into temporary holdings so that he could clean inside the cages too. There was never a dirty dish or pile of laundry lying around. The spotless house was always tropically warm, with most of his inheritance going to the electricity bill to keep the heat lamps going. On the morning of February the 19th, Mark got up at 5 in the morning. Winter in Germany meant that the sun wouldn't be up until well past 8. But it was feeding day, and Mark wanted to get an early start. He slipped on his winter boots, took out the trash, and got straight to work. It would take him all day to visit every one of the holdings in the house. Like always, he began with his beloved black widows. But uncharacteristically, Mark accidentally left the smallest sliver of the tank's lid open. It was only a matter of time before the 7 widows inside realized that their holding was no longer secure. Mark went about his day, systematically feeding every one of the macabre inhabitants of his glass tanks. Inevitably, the first of the 7 found its way out of the tank. After hours inside the bedroom, it found Mark's winter boots, still warm from Mark's feet from that morning when he'd taken out the trash. It crawled inside. and there it stayed while 2 more spiders crawled out of the cage and started to explore. Mark never even noticed the missing spiders or the open tank when he finally returned to his bedroom late that afternoon. He slipped on the boots that held the deadly little predator and headed out the door to reach the grocery store before it got dark. The moment Mark put his right foot into that boot, 2 things happened. He crushed the spider with his big toe, and as he squished it against the leather of the boot, it reacted with the only weapon it had, its fangs. They were so tiny that Mark didn't even feel the teeth penetrating his skin, and he simply walked to the store, made his usual small talk, and left to walk back the 2 blocks he'd come. Halfway home, Mark's foot began to ache slightly, and by the time he'd kicked off his boots back in his bedroom, half of his right foot was already red and hot. Mark didn't think too much of it at first. He just thought it was a blister and decided to go have it checked out in the morning if it got any worse during the night. 2 hours later, Mark got up to fix himself some dinner, but his foot, that had been only a mild hindrance before, simply gave out on him. It throbbed painfully, and it was now starting to turn purple. Despite his shortening breath and the sweat forming on his brow, Mark was still hesitant to go to the emergency room. It meant leaving his house, his street, and everything that was familiar to him. If it got to that point, he'd rather have an ambulance treat him inside his home. His deathly fear of retreating outside his own door was an even greater threat than dying. Mark had tried to avoid reality for the past 10 years. He was deeply agoraphobic. And as the night progressed, Mark's condition just became worse and worse. He blamed his burning stomach and the nausea on hunger because he hadn't had the strength to make himself something to eat. He began to run a fever that was high enough on its own to validate a stay in the hospital. And still, Mark refused to pick up the phone. All the while, the black widows in the tank were escaping into the house, one by one. Now, normally a bite from a black widow wouldn't have caused this extreme reaction, and in all honesty, they're rarely fatal. But Mark had been virtually immobile for the last decade. He was already showing worrying signs of diabetes, and his terrible diet and lack of exercise had weakened his heart. Mark became an expert at convincing himself that his long list of symptoms was not nearly as serious as it was, anything to avoid leaving his home. Even without the bite, he was a ticking time bomb, and now the venom was thriving in his weakened body. For 2 days, Mark lay on his living room floor, the flesh in his foot beginning to die and turn black. The fever and the pain in his abdomen and chest made him delirious. Neighbors reported hearing someone shouting for their mother 2 days after he'd been bitten. Finally, on February the 21st, almost 3 whole days after the initial bite, Mark, dehydrated and out of his mind, died on his living room floor. His lungs flooded with fluid, and the weight on his chest caused a massive heart attack. For the next week, that's where Mark lay while his pets became hungrier and hungrier. It was the lizards who broke out first, and during their explorations they knocked over a few of the tank's lids, leaving the hundreds of spiders free to crawl over the house. Inevitably, they found Mark's body. In the heated structure, the decomposition set in quickly, and his corpse offered them the only source of food they could find. After not seeing Mark for 9 days, the shop clerks called in for a wellness check. Mark was never out of sync with his routine, and they knew that he had no family or friends to check up on him. When police arrived, they could smell the decomposing body before they even stepped onto the porch. Inside, the stench was overwhelming, and the house was alive with scuttling and movement from the many creatures swarming all over every surface. Eerily illuminated by their tank's blue and red lights, it smelled and looked like a horror movie. They'd started on the soft tissue on Mark's cheeks and the protein-rich eyeballs. They'd moved over to his tongue, and the bigger lizards had even taken chunks out of his bare arms. His body was almost entirely black from the swarm that had settled upon him, crawling out of his open mouth, nesting in his hair. In the end, there were just too many venomous animals inside the home to allow the authorities to move the body out of an open door. If they got out, it was almost certain that they'd find their way to one of the other homes on the street. They left Mark where he lay and threw fumigation canisters into the door, killing every single creature inside, lizards, snakes, spiders, and all. 2 days after the mass killing, they opened all the doors and windows and stepped inside to remove the remains. Mark was buried with the last remaining money still left in his estate that he hadn't managed to spend on exotic pets. And he was buried alone, with no one left to attend the recluse's funeral, not even his beloved pets that had caused his terrifying final affliction.